I'd encountered the bishop's letter primarily through references and quotations and so on in accounts of an earlier generation's intra-Catholic controversies. So it was very useful to read through the actual document itself and be reminded of, well, where those controversies came from. And from my point of view, particularly sort of where Catholic neoconservatism came from, which I think was in part in reaction to what I would characterize as a certain kind of sort of policy naivete that I think is manifest in the often excruciating specificity with which the bishop's letter addressed the American economy in the Reagan era. And I want to make just a couple of comments about that, and then a couple of comments that are hopefully slightly more sympathetic to the impulses that led to this letter being published and to our problems today. I think that, you know, when you think about where Catholic neoconservatism came from, the Catholic neoconservatism of a George Weigel, a Michael Novak, after his conversion, a Richard John Newhouse, and many others, I think it was in what I see a generation later as some of the persistent weaknesses of a document like this one. And, you know, this is going to sound, I think, a bit like conservative boilerplate, but sometimes boilerplate is useful to put out there because it, you know, has a certain purchase on the truth. I think in this document, the Catholic bishops in the midst of the Reagan era paid insufficient attention to the imperative of economic growth, focused too heavily on redistribution at the expense of growth as sort of the centerpiece of the sort of design of a just economy. I think again and again in the document you have a certain naivete about both trade-offs within public policy and the kind of critiques of well-meaning policy that certainly many conservatives would level. There's an assumption that I think throughout that well-meaning government policy is identical to effective government policy, which I think is not always borne out by events. I think that there's an assumption throughout that Catholic ideas about solidarity and the common good and so on can really be effectively lived out and embodied by a national bureaucracy that governs a nation then of 200 million people, soon to be 400 million people. And I think that is a persistent deficit, not only in liberal Catholic thought, but in liberal thought more generally, going all the way back, well, going all the way back in many ways, but certainly going back to the 1970s and 1980s, where I think many liberals start from, I think, correct assumptions about sort of what human beings want from society, what they want from each other, the need to live in community with each other and so on, and then leap to the assumption that all of this can be lived out through a kind of community of 400 million people, which I think in many cases is a kind of contradiction in terms. And finally, then, I think that there is, as I said before, throughout the document, a maddening specificity about issues on which nothing in the document gives me competence that the authors have the overall, well, frankly, policy chops to be so specific about. And I think that it ends up, I think I end up agreeing on this with the handout that you have includes a critique from, not surprisingly, William Simon and Michael Novak, where they make the point that, essentially the bishops, quote, risk cloaking their political and social opinions on concrete matters with ecclesiastical authority. And I think they end up, for someone who, comes to this, I would say imagine coming to this as a student of public policy first, and not necessarily a Catholic, somebody, let's say, with an open mind about the ecclesiastical authority that the Catholic bishops claim to hold. I think a document like this one, its very specificity risks undercutting that authority, because if you invest a general authority in specifics where you don't actually have competence, you end up undercutting your claims to that broader authority. And so this if you read the excerpts that are collated here, that, as you said, make the sort of establish the philosophical and political premises behind this document, I find myself, not always agreeing, but in general agreement. It's when you move from that general to the specifics that I think the document runs into trouble very quickly. And I think it runs into trouble in ways that, I think that in the 80s and then down to the present day, I think there's been a persistent failure of, on the Catholic left to confront the reasons why the policy prescriptions embodied in this document have not formed the basis for public policy, not only in the United States, but in the West as a whole. That overall, the trend, not only in America under Reagan and so on with our cowboy capitalism and what have you, but also in the social democracies of Western Europe, the response to the economic crisis of the 1970s, there was a shift away, or an attempted shift away from bureaucracy towards a more dynamic free market and so on. And the fact that this happened in very different political contexts across a wide range of countries, I think provides the best implicit critique of some of the sort of, I'd just say sort of basically statist assumptions embodied in this document. So that's my sort of broad initial reaction to reading through this for the first time. Another point that I would make, though, is that I think what gives me sympathy for the bishops and for the specifics of this document is the extent to which Catholic social teaching tends to get trapped. It's easy for someone like me to say, well, the bishops have become way too specific here, exceeded their ecclesiastical authority and so on, and that it's perfectly possible to be a good Catholic and disagree with, 9 out of 10 prescriptions on page, let's say 39 or something. But then if, the bishops retreat back to the general principles and say, well, all right, we're gonna step back and say, well, we'll talk about subsidiarity without getting specific about what that means. We'll talk about a preferential option for the poor without getting specific about what that means. What happens inevitably is that partisans on both sides, Catholic Republicans and Catholic Democrats, just say, okay, that's great. I support the general principles, and I'll let my political party be my guide about the specifics, which I think it has become in many ways as grave a danger to sort of a distinctively Catholic role in American politics today as any of the sort of sometimes naive liberalism that I think this embodied 25 years ago. And I think what you see today too often in the Catholic neoconservatism that emerged as a reaction to this document is just that move. You just say, well, I agree with the bishops on the general, on the specifics they're naively liberal, and here's a Catholic gloss on whatever John Boehner has done this week. And I don't particularly have, I don't have a sort of brilliant solution to this problem, but I would say that reading a document like this, my initial reaction is that the failures the failures of Catholics in public life to provide a distinctively Catholic as opposed to Republican or Democratic witness over the last 20 to 25 years ultimately have to be laid at the doors of Catholic lay people rather than the bishops, and that it isn't in the end. I think that the bishops get stuck in a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't position, and they're almost always, and they were in that position during the healthcare debate. They're in that position with almost every public policy debate. But I don't think the answer is necessarily for Catholic lay people and Catholic politicians to just sit around and blast the bishops for whatever they've done. I think in the end, there is a lay Catholic responsibility to be specific without claiming an ecclesiastical mantle, but to spend a lot more time than partisans on either side do grounding that specificity in Catholic premises rather than the premises of right and left.